Just so you know, this show is about scary stuff. So don't say I didn't warn you guys. And remember, don't be scared.
Episode 132, A Family Matter. War Baby here with another episode of Murderous Minors. The North Carolina Supreme Court recently threw out the sentence of convicted juvenile killer Riley Dawson Conner, who has been incarcerated since he was arrested at 15 years old for the violent rape and murder of his father's sister, his 45-year-old aunt Felicia Moore Porter. This week on Murderous Minors, we look at the murder case behind that high court's recent decision, along with the other ramifications his original consecutive sentences have had on juvenile justice legislation in the state of North Carolina. Please be advised that sexual assault will be mentioned. Conner's mother and other relatives testified later as to many details about his childhood, and she said that her son began experiencing disruptive sleep patterns between the ages of 1 and 2. His family called them night terrors, but his mother testified that she later realized that his nighttime behaviors were likely epileptic in nature. His true condition would go undiagnosed for another decade. Court transcripts indicate that she was 18 and his father was 20 when they had him in August 2000. The family lived together on Miller Road near Tabor City, North Carolina, a border town known to some as the yam capital of the world, and located only about 30 miles north of popular vacation spot Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. Conner's parents had substance abuse issues and his mother heavily abused crack cocaine, while his father sold marijuana and participated in other criminal activities that made the home environment unfit for children. The family next moved to a house on Savannah Extension Road in Tabor City, North Carolina, in close proximity to many extended family members from both sides, including grandparents, a great-grandmother, aunts, uncles, and cousins. One would imagine that having such easy access to lots of family would have helped Conner deal with not having either parent around. However, the area that they lived in was tough and hard scrabble, leaving little time for proper mentoring or parenting. At the tender age of 4, Conner was home when his house was raided and his father and uncle arrested at gunpoint for being in possession of a literal, quote, truckload of marijuana, one of the handful of times he'd see his father taken into custody. They ended up moving into his mother's parents' home when he was 5 and his sister was a newborn, with his mom testifying later that she was, quote, strung out on crack cocaine and running the roads, having left the care of her kids to her parents. When Conner's baby sister had been born, their father borrowed a van that he was supposed to use to retrieve his wife and child from the hospital. Instead, though, he's accused of having driven through the front window of a gas station to steal cigarettes and the jar of money they kept on the counter to buy drugs, and he never picked them up. That was according to an aunt on Conner's mom's side, who also said the area they lived in was, quote, the pits of hell, while his own mother called it, quote, nowhere for a child to be because there's nothing but drugs down there. He really didn't need to be down there, and if I could go back, I'd change it. During her testimony, that aunt also reflected on Conner's childhood of being passed between relatives, saying that his, quote, mother and father were constantly in and out of his life, calling them, quote, not by any means anywhere close to being stable parents. They rejected him time and time again. The court records indicate that Conner's father was released from prison when the child was 5 but was soon arrested again, this time along with Conner's mother, who acted as a getaway driver while he committed a robbery. By then, their son had started school, and his mother later testified that Conner was heavily teased because of their issues. When he was 6, his father was sentenced to 7 years in prison, and the following year, his mother's drug use contributed to her violating her probation, and she was sent to prison herself. By her own testimony, she had already been largely absent, quote, running the roads, getting in trouble. Crack took over my whole life, and that was all I was worried about, was going to get the next hit. Her sister testified that Conner's parents missed nearly all of his early birthday parties and recalled that his mother only came to 1 or 2 of the celebrations. She also remembered her nephew running behind his mother's car as she drove away one time when he was 7, while he screamed, "I hate you," and begged her to stay. She said that her parents would buy gifts for Conner and his sister, but that their parents would sell them and use the money to help fund their habits. Around the same time, Social Services received a call from the aunt saying that the Conner children had been taken to a crack house and custody was awarded to their mom's parents, but they couldn't care for them either, and they often stayed with the aunt, who later testified. From 7 to 8 years old, his aunt noticed that Conner's night terrors had only worsened, during which you couldn't wake him. He was noted to flail his arms and sling himself at things while pacing the house. At 8 years old, a doctor diagnosed Conner with ADHD and attributed these nighttime episodes to possible PTSD, but no follow-up was made. His grandma had a stroke around this time, and Conner was then cared for by his mother, who was back living on Savannah Road. His performance at school was well below satisfactory, no doubt attributed to his continued lack of adequate sleep. Conner would also be pulled out of school frequently due to being bullied and his violent interactions with his classmates. He was held back and had to repeat the 3rd grade, and self-reported that he started smoking marijuana at 9 years old. His mother remarried and they moved to live with her new husband, but then his dad got paroled and remarried a year later, and Conner went back to Savannah Road to live with him for the first time in several years. They all lived with his dad's grandma, along with an aunt and her son, Conner's cousin Brad. By all accounts, Conner idolized the man, who was roughly 10 years older and a known criminal and addict whose profession was selling drugs such as meth, cocaine, PCP, heroin, and opiates. He was known to regularly supply the 10-year-old with whatever he wanted, while Brad's mother took Conner with her to motels while she worked in the sex trade. Conner was heavily abusing the prescription drug Xanax by the time he was 11 years old, sometimes taking 8 at a time, and began drinking alcohol almost every day, often until he passed out. By the time he was 12, he'd become sexually active and failed the 5th grade, but instead of repeating, he changed schools and they put him into the 6th grade at the middle school. He was staying with his aunt then, and she testified that he was confrontational there as well, saying that she just, quote, lost the ability to influence him. He went to live with his father on Savannah Road, but when he tried to get back into the 6th grade at the middle school, they admitted him, but they didn't know what to do with him because he had issues with so many of the kids who already attended there. He was ultimately expelled for bullying and disruptive behavior and went to an alternative school for a bit before returning to live with his mother because his father went back to prison, this time for robbing a bank. He went to an alternative school in South Carolina where he was expelled and charged with assault for hitting a classmate in the head with a textbook, a charge which was later dismissed. Conner was re-enrolled but was expelled again after being adjudicated delinquent in juvenile court for possessing marijuana at the school, and an evaluation completed by the South Carolina Department of Justice determined that his IQ then was 79 and represented, quote, borderline intellectual functioning. It appears that Conner never went any further in school than the 6th grade, although he was supposed to be being homeschooled by his grandmother. That never happened. His aunt testified that her parents had simply become unable to care for him. Court records refer to Conner around this period as a, quote, free agent starting between age 12 and 13, left to roam unsupervised, drink alcohol, have sex, and use drugs that his cousins supplied him with. At 13, doctors determined that Conner had been having nightly disruptive epileptic seizures since he was a baby, and that he'd never been having night terrors at all. He was formally diagnosed with frontal lobe epilepsy and was placed on a cocktail of medications that no one made sure he took. Conner was also diagnosed with behavior problems and a year later with mild conduct disorder, severe cannabis use disorder, moderate alcohol use disorder, sedative use disorder, and disruption of family. When he was 14, he had a falling out with his aunt and cousin and went back to his mother in South Carolina before couch surfing at his stepsisters, his father's ex-wife, and his father in Florida before returning to his mom's. All the while, he was having more and more seizures. By the time Conner was 15 and a half in January 2016, his uncontrolled seizures had increased in both severity and frequency, going from 6 to 10 per night to up to 12 per night the following month, as determined by emergency room doctors. Conner visited another doctor soon after who said that PTSD could be exacerbating his epilepsy, and he changed his meds on February 25, 2016. Less than a week later, on March 2nd, Conner stole his mom's van and used it to break into the Fowler's grocery store and steal cigarettes, eerily reminiscent of his dad's actions when his sister had been born. Conner's mom reported the van stolen, and police soon realized it was the same person who had robbed the store because they had security camera footage showing the 4 a.m. break-in. When police caught up with the van at 8 a.m., Conner's mom was driving and he was in the passenger seat, having returned home earlier with the cigarettes he'd boosted in the heist. He was charged in juvenile court for, quote, breaking or entering, larceny after breaking or entering, and larceny of a motor vehicle and possession of a stolen vehicle. Police also scheduled Conner to see a juvenile court counselor a week and a half later on March 11, 2016. After the police officers left from Savannah Road, one of Conner's dad's sisters, Felicia Porter, called 911 to report that her 15-year-old nephew had gotten into a fight inside his great-grandma's house, telling dispatchers about the crimes he'd allegedly committed earlier that day and saying that he, quote, needs to get locked up. Court documents indicate that Conner told multiple people that he was going to, quote, make that bitch Felicia pay. 9 days later, it seems that he did just that. A timeline of March 11, 2016 was determined and laid out in the documents, indicating that Felicia Porter awoke at 6 a.m. and dropped her husband off at his carpool spot for work. She was back home by 9 a.m. and checking her social media. Shortly after that, Conner's step-grandfather was trying to get his truck unstuck from a field and saw him walking toward his Aunt Felicia's house around 9:30 a.m. The teen would say later that he'd already smoked marijuana and snorted PCP that morning. When Felicia came to the door, Conner got her to come outside and the 15-year-old attacked and violently raped her, his own aunt, before beating the woman to death with a shovel left lying nearby. All of her front teeth had been smashed out of her mouth and she had numerous broken bones in her face, as well as a broken arm and multiple lacerations. Conner moved Felicia's body about 100 yards away into the wooded area adjacent to her trailer. He burned an article of her clothing on her burn pile and set off walking back to his great-grandmother's house. He encountered his step-grandfather again, who said that the teen had been heavily perspiring and that the pair spoke about the appointment that Conner had with the juvenile court counselor later that afternoon. When Felicia Porter stopped answering her phone, Conner's great-grandmother sent his step-grandfather to check on her, accompanied by his cousin Brad, who first helped get the truck unstuck from the field. Right around the time that Conner and his mother left for his counseling appointment, his Aunt Felicia was determined to be missing from her home, her front door ajar. The Columbus County Sheriff's Department was notified, and an official missing persons report was filed, with local news that evening announcing that Felicia Porter had last been seen around Fowler's Supermarket on Swamp Fox Highway East earlier that morning. The following afternoon, at approximately 2:30 p.m., deputies located her body in the woods by her house, and results from her autopsy indicated that homicidal violence had caused Felicia Porter's death. The State Bureau of Investigations joined in on the search for her killer, and although they didn't release any information pertaining to her manner of death or injuries, the sheriff did say that, quote, "I encourage the Tabor City community to carry on their normal activities. There is no reason to fear for your safety." A rape kit had been performed on Felicia's body and DNA had been recovered, which would ultimately be linked to her nephew Riley Conner alone. On the day Felicia had been found, Saturday, March 12, 2016, Conner was questioned by police for the first time, giving the first of several stories about the events of the previous day. Conner told police that he'd actually walked in the opposite direction of his aunt's home and had seen a suspicious vehicle in the vicinity. He'd been staying at his great-grandmother's and Felicia's grandmother's home on Savannah Road, but left Tabor City and North Carolina altogether once that first interview was complete, going back across the border to stay with his mom. 4 days later, she took him to the emergency room because his epilepsy just kept getting worse. Conner's mother told the doctors that his arms and legs were all bruised up because his seizures had become so violent. They'd also increased in frequency to as many as 15 per night, leading up to a frighteningly severe seizure that caused Conner to foam at the mouth and lose control of his bodily functions 5 days after the ER visit. He was then hospitalized for 4 days and diagnosed with poorly controlled intractable frontal lobe epilepsy, quote, complicated by non-compliance of medication, lack of insight of his condition, and severe oppositional behavior problem, and agitation that often is due to the frequent partial epilepsy. While admitted to UNC Memorial Hospital, Conner's seizures reportedly broke his bed and he suffered more than 24 per night. Doctors noted that his, quote, partial seizures are associated with psychiatric agitation, that significant behavioral changes could well be due to uncontrolled frontal seizures, and that Conner's, quote, frontal lobe epilepsy may affect a patient's ability to regulate his emotions and prevents a patient from getting adequate sleep. The psychiatrist said that, quote, mood liability and agitation are at least in part due to his frontal lobe seizures, and an MRI showed, quote, damage to his frontal lobe on the right side, consistent with scarring from numerous childhood head injuries. According to court documents, Conner's mother assaulted him while he was in the hospital, which resulted in his being placed in his stepsister's care by social services when he was released on March 25, 2016. On March 29th, Conner spoke to police 3 times, telling them that he had indeed walked toward his aunt's house on the day she was murdered, contrary to what he'd told them the day her body was found. But he said that it had only been to check on the pot plant he was growing in the woods. Then he requested investigators come back out so he could tell them some story about accompanying his cousin Brad to retrieve a pilfered kilo of heroin from Felicia's husband. Conner told investigators that it was his cousin who had hit his aunt with a brick before raping and killing her, but then Conner said that he had raped her but that Brad had killed her. Following that interview, Conner experienced an emotional breakdown that resulted in him insisting his mother call investigators, who came back out to speak with him again. His last version of the story that day saw him recanting the heroin stuff but sticking to the part about Brad committing the crimes. Conner did, however, add in his third statement that day that he'd helped with all of it, marking the first time that he'd even admitted to any involvement in his aunt's death. After spending all day speaking to investigators, 15-year-old Riley Dawson Conner was arrested just after midnight on March 30th, 2016. He tested positive for PCP and marijuana after having a terrible seizure that night in juvenile detention. His charges were filed in juvenile court, but the prosecutor made it clear that he planned to try Conner as an adult. The sheriff announced the arrest of a suspect in Felicia's murder, but released no indication as to the identity of her suspected killer, only saying that it was a juvenile and that, quote, both families have suffered a loss and need the community's continued support and prayers. 8 months later, in mid-December 2016, Conner was indicted by a grand jury on charges of murder and first-degree forcible rape in his aunt's assault and death, along with larceny of a motor vehicle, breaking and entering, larceny after breaking and entering, and 2 counts of possession of stolen goods for the grocery store robbery from just before the murder. It was then reported that he would be tried as an adult, and Conner's name and details were allowed to be reported following his transfer hearing. Ultimately, the teen was offered a deal and pled guilty on February 21, 2019, to first-degree murder with premeditation and deliberation and first-degree rape. The other charges dismissed in exchange for the plea of guilty. Prosecutors were asking for life without parole, but the defense painted the picture of a child who'd had limited positive role models and whose rough upbringing, PTSD, and epilepsy precluded him from being sentenced to life without parole. It took Judge Stone less than half an hour to sentence the then 18-year-old to life with parole possibility after 25 years for the murder and 20 to 25 years for the first-degree rape charge. The sentences are to be served consecutively, meaning that Conner wouldn't be eligible for parole until around 60 years old. The defense objected, calling the back-to-back structure equivalent to a sentence of life without parole and thus a violation of the Eighth Amendment, but was overruled. One of Felicia's aunts said that, quote, "It's not what we really wanted, but we're satisfied with it. It won't bring Felicia back, but at least we know that he's not getting off." By then, Cousin Brad was locked up himself because just 5 days before Conner's sentencing, he allegedly cut off his ankle monitoring device and stole a truck in North Carolina before attempting to rob a store in South Carolina. Once back across state lines, Brad ditched the truck and stole a different truck. He then led officers from several jurisdictions on a high-speed chase through several people's yards that almost resulted in a head-on collision with multiple police officers before getting stuck in some mud in the woods and was apprehended after taking off on foot. Conner appealed his consecutive sentences, and his case was ultimately reviewed by the North Carolina Supreme Court, resulting in a bombshell announcement. On June 17, 2022, a, quote, sharply divided state Supreme Court ruled that 40 years in prison is the maximum that juvenile offenders in their state could be sentenced to before becoming parole eligible. JLWOP sentences can still be handed down in North Carolina, but only if the offender has been deemed irreparably corrupt, permanently incorrigible, or irredeemable. A few days after that decision, on June 21, 2022, the High Court announced that they had ruled on Conner's appeal and agreed with the defense that his consecutive sentences do indeed demonstrate cruel and unusual punishment and combined are too severe and violate the Constitution, given the mitigating factors in his case. The majority wrote in their decision, quote, that juvenile offenders who have received sentences of life imprisonment with the possibility for parole, while not guaranteed parole at any point during their respective terms of incarceration, nonetheless must have the opportunity to seek an early release afforded by the prospect of parole after serving no more than 40 years of incarceration. To compel defendant to serve a term of incarceration in excess of 40 years upon the trial court's determination that defendant, in light of his status as a juvenile, is neither incorrigible nor irredeemable, would unconstitutionally constitute a de facto life sentence. His sentences have been thrown out, and Riley Conner will face a new sentencing hearing in late fall 2022, knowing that no more than 40 years will pass before he can apply to be paroled. Following the High Court's decision, Columbus County District Attorney John David had this to say.
I'm disappointed by the ruling of a divided Supreme Court panel, but nonetheless, we will abide by that court's decision. However, in doing that, I want to reassure the citizens of Columbus County that we will fight very hard to keep Riley Conner in prison for as long as possible.
As always, thanks for listening. Be back soon with an all-new episode, but until then, lovelies, don't be scared.